Next question comes from, do nationally televised games really determine end of year awards? That was Darkwing Duck from Discord. I'm going to scroll down from my Google Doc here because we have some other like thoughts that are or questions that are tangentially related to this. I'll loop those next two together. So Nick Wright asks on Twitter, will Nick Wright ever be right? That was from Paul. I might have just wrote down the wrong name there. And so like there's just this I'm assuming this pertains specifically to Rudy Gobert and Nikola Jokic. The awards we're talking about are regular season awards. And so I can't like view what's happening in the postseason as something that has this transcendent impact on who I would choose for MVP or defensive player of the year. If you're using it as a tiebreaker, as who would you rather have in a playoff series, if it really was down to that, and it was Jokic or Giannis for you, and that's what you wanted to use as the tiebreaker, I don't think I would fault you there. I also think, though, that we tend to oversimplify these nationally televised games. What happens in the playoffs? We make these referendums on ultra small sample sizes when, in the end, the NBA for the good teams is an 82 plus game sample size across the season. And so the macro picture matters here. And if anything, what's happening in Denver with the Nuggets going up against the Warriors and kind of seeing like they're up for slaughter, I don't mean to say that before we go through a game 3 in Denver. It only, to me, makes it more impressive that Jokic dragged them to 48 wins there. I just don't understand what the problem is with that or why it's so hard to separate. There are the people, the paid employees, the fans that have their agendas, and some of them are pretty just obvious about it, and it's all in good nature, which is fine. But this idea that Nikola Jokic is a faux MVP or that the computer skewed the returns in his favor, it's not fair, and it's lazy, and it's oversimplified, and I get tired of it. That being said, like there is higher end analysis out there, and we have to remember that the talking heads on TV, they're paid to, whether it's in specific these exact terms or not, it's an engagement at all costs type of industry now. And we can bemoan it. I've bemoaned it privately at times with people that I trust. I've had just wholesale conversations about it. But however you want to watch or consume the league, that avenue is essentially available to you. NBA media is flawed in just so many ways when it comes down to the still just a glaring lack of diversity. But it's also sort of a golden age of options when you just look at the localized coverage. I think team podcasts and writers have just become so important this day and age, especially ones I have infinite respect for beat writers, but also those who are more detached from the teams and their opinions, their livelihood isn't so tightly moored to access that maybe they could be just a little more honest or a little bit more punitive with their coverage. And there's just a nice mix of everything. I try to consume as much of it. And look, I'll even admit that I do at times just feel like, and I don't want to, I'm not conventional national media, but as someone who talks about, writes about, puts a lot of effort into trying to cover the NBA at large as fairly as possible. I hate when it feels like I'm being looped into like, oh, the national media doesn't talk about Rudy Gobert enough, or the national media is against Nikola Jokic. Some of these like adversarial takes against Jokic and Gobert, I don't even see them. Like I'll see someone tweet about it. Oh, but they told me that Nikola Jokic couldn't pass, or just something stupid like that. And I'll just be like, is my Twitter bubble so insulated that I just didn't even see this take? Is it an actual take? Who are you following or listening to or watching that is saying these things? And if you're that fundamentally disagree or you think it's unfair, like there are other ways to go. And no, I promise I'm not bitter that poor me who doesn't get like enough recognition for the work he puts in the Harvard Knox and Bleacher Report. That's really not what I meant. It's just like I don't want to be looped into like the lower brow analysis. I'm not like the X's and O savants that you're going to get if it's like an Achias Duncan. No, but I do put a ton of effort into covering the league at large and going deeper and trying to have a pulse on every team. And also what I do think we forget, and this is the localized coverage is so important, but I've come to view my job as one, very unserious, as anyone could tell. Like I cover a fucking game, but also to have a pulse on the entire league better than the localized people. And it's not to say that I'm better at my job. And the thing that's beautiful about the localized podcasts and writers, they are seeing every team because the teams that they cover go up against them, but they do a great job like stepping into the national waters. And I know a lot of them are watching and covering more than just their team's basketball. You look at Caitlin Cooper and the Twitter thread she does and some of the podcast topics that she covers. The guys at the Timeline podcast do a fantastic job of having a pulse in the entire league. But for the fans in general, it's my job to have a better pulse on the entire league than even not just the fan of a singular team, but of the general NBA fan. And that's what I'm there for. That's why I've come to view my job. And so I put a lot of effort into doing that. I get bitter to myself. I don't really voice it unless it's to this podcast at this very moment about when I see those things about the national media, there's like a pang inside of me. And I have to remember if you don't think you fall under that umbrella, then it's not about you. But that is something I struggle with. I do think though that we have to remember that some of this is whether you want to, I won't go as far as to say it's an agenda, but it's for the sake of drumming up conversation. Those are the easiest talking points to have, or the easiest talking points that will incite reaction. And that's what a lot of people want at the end of the day. That's how, that's just their job, whether it's specifically stated in their description or not. You look at Rudy Gobert specifically, which I think this question was also aimed at, is just when the discourse around him has just been fucking absurd because he is not the problem for the Jazz's defense. You go back and look at game 2 against Dallas. Yeah, there were some things that I guess he did wrong, but he doesn't adjust to what I would consider their base defense a ton of the time because they don't make the adjustments. Like, is it on him to decide like, oh, I have to change up my coverage here, and instead of helping towards the driver, that I need to be closer to the guy in the corner? The Jazz have been designed to funnel people towards Rudy Gobert all season. The amount of ground that he has to cover on certain possessions to where he's around the rim, but he can be pulled away from the basket. He's covering out to the corners. Like, it's overwhelming. And their failure to put the right perimeter defenders around him, people who can contain the ball, not get that consistent effort from Donovan Mitchell, that's the issue. And it's even the Donovan Mitchell blow-bys. Like, there's an element of that. Yes, it's not by design, but like, you've built your defense around funneling people towards Rudy Gobert. Is it his fault that it's falling apart when teams are better built to attack it and work the corners, or put your entire team in rotations that they're not built to handle? Shout out Bojan Bogdanovic. So it's just, I don't understand why we can't look at that and identify it. Even as someone who's such a basketball idiot as myself can understand that. How do you look at the game and say, oh, he's such a liability when they go small? Then somehow you're not watching the game properly, or you're just saying something for the sake of saying something at some point. And so, yeah, I get that it can be mega frustrating on both sides of the fence. And then it all of a sudden turns into like this war between analytics versus the eye test, when it's just anyone that matters. I have never seen only rely on one. Anyone that I respect or that is really has an impact on the way that people think about basketball, I've never just seen them point to one catch-all thing, eye test, analytics, whatever, one stat, one play, one singular game referendum. So I don't even know why that has to be a discussion. If you're complaining that Rudy Gobert didn't win Defensive Player of the Year, or if you're even, you think Giannis should have been the MVP, we also have to do a better job of recognizing that there are multiple deserving candidates, and that a lot of this stuff comes down to a matter of taste or preference, which we're going to get into with these two questions, which I thought were fascinating. So the first one comes from Henrik Ahmed. Statistically, who is the best defender, Gobert or Smart? And then Ryan Mortensen asks, thoughts on Smart winning Defensive Player of the Year over Rudy? I'd love to see a side-by-side comparison of all the defensive stats. And so here's the thing. Defensive stats are going to be inherently flawed anyway. There's just, at least maybe there's, internally teams have proprietary metrics that do a better job of measuring impact, but the ones that are publicly available, the ones that I even know of that aren't publicly available, it's impossible to quantify the defense in the same way that we do offense. What also gets tough, but let's look at the Smart Gobert debate specifically. So in defensive estimated plus minus, Rudy Gobert ranks 5th in the league this season. Smart was 13th. This is just the regular season. In defensive LeBron, Gobert was 1st. Smart was 64th. In luck adjusted, regularized adjusted plus minus, Rudy Gobert was 16th. Smart was 57th. In defensive Raptor, Rudy Gobert was 4th. Smart was 41st. So you look at some of those kitchen sink metrics and you think it's outrageous that Smart would be in the defensive player of the year discussion, but their roles are so different. You look at the matchup difficulty ratings of these two, because Smart is tackling more primary ball handlers, more explosive perimeter guys, covering more ends of the positional spectrum. He ranks 39th in matchup difficulty for this past season. That was among anyone who logged at least 1,000 minutes. Rudy Gobert was 180th. So Rudy Gobert's trash because he is matchup difficult. Like, are we going to go that route as well? Their roles are so different. Rudy Gobert contested 6.9 shots at the rim per game this year. Marcus Smart was at 2.1, which is actually high for someone his size. There's such a fundamental difference in what they're responsible for. And it's fine if you want to make the case that bigs are always going to be more pivotal to the defensive model, and so they should get the bump in the defensive player of the year discussion. If that's a philosophy that you ascribe to, it is perfectly fine. I won't argue with you against it. I mean, if you like, there's been support out there, which is why I'm accepting it. I'm not just saying someone could come up to me and say, I'll only vote for a big and that's that. But what did we just talk about with the Jazz 2 seconds ago? About how the lack of perimeter defenders or quality help defenders around him have really fucked the Jazz over and made it easy for people to think that he's the problem. So if perimeter defenders are that important to Rudy Gobert's success, or let's say failure in Utah for certain stretches, doesn't that kind of make the case that a Marcus Smart or Mikal Bridges is super valuable on defense because they have to pick up the toughest singular assignments? They're going to be at guarding the primary actions more than he is. Yeah, he's responsible for more. He's calling out coverages. People point out that Marcus Smart does that in Boston. I would also like to point out that Mikal Bridges, aside from just covering the toughest assignment on a night-to-night basis, is one of the best transition defenders that honestly I've ever seen. But also just makes the job easier on a big like DeAndre Ayton because it shrinks the scope of what DeAndre Ayton is responsible for. And I'm not saying, even though I thought people thought that the pick for Marcus Smart and Mikal Bridges as defensive player of the year was fucking stupid. And I won't subscribe to that. I believe they were my top three. I can't remember who had third on my ballot. I should really look at that. I'd go Gobert second behind Bridges. If Rudy Gobert would have won, I'm not going to give you any pushback. Could it have been voter fatigue on some level? Maybe. Could it be the fact that people look too much into team stats or success in general rather than the team success or stats with that player on the floor? And the Jazz were elite defensively with Rudy Gobert on the floor? Maybe. Is there too much value even placed in that because the Suns were technically better defensively without Mikal Bridges on the floor? But that's only because of he's going up against starter competition, the level of individual competition he faces, and also the Suns were still elite with him on the court. It's just that the other lineups he weren't in posted better defensive ratings against lesser competition for the most part. There is context and reasons for everything. You just have to dig a little bit deeper. So I do think some of the coverage, I'm not going to call it national coverage or localized coverage or TV coverage. Some of the coverage has gotten lazy and frustrating, but the right coverage or the one that aligns with how you want to view the game is out there. And we just don't have to pay the ones that are truly out there too much credence. I don't think no one I know is taking what Nick Wright specifically says or even what Stephen A says and allowing it to shape their basketball opinions. Those are people who are responsible for covering the full breadth of sports and rather than just basketball. And so if you're just a fan of the NBA specifically or a team in the NBA specifically, basketball in general, throw the WNBA, college basketball into there as well, you're going to probably have a better pulse on what's happening in the league than the people who have to cover a wider scope of sports in general. And so it trickles down like that to where Nick Wright is not going to be as in tune with the NBA as Zach Lowe. And Zach Lowe, though, isn't going to be as in tune with the Pelicans rotations as the In the Know podcast guys, Mason Ginsberg and Shamit Dua, because that's the team that they're covering on a regular basis, and Zach Lowe has to cover the entire league. I don't think one person is more or less important than the other or one type of coverage. They're all important. Like I said, I have so much respect for the localized coverage, the localized podcasts. I try to listen to as many as possible. I would categorize as I listen to more than most, and I'm sure much less than some. And they help me a lot in how I approach covering their teams and the game in general. So that's important. And I'm not saying that what a Nick Wright or the Talking Heads are doing isn't important. It's a different type of coverage. It's not meant to be that granular, and there's more of high stakes engagement at play there. That's just my opinion on that matter. So to this Smart winning defensive player of the year, Rudy Gobert, I don't have an issue with it as long as we're willing to have honest discussions about it. If you picked Marcus Smart because you think Rudy Gobert is a liability against smaller lineups or just a liability in general in the playoffs, then no, I don't want to say that your opinion's invalid, but I'm going to fundamentally disagree with that. If you think it's dumb that Marcus Smart won defensive player of the year because he didn't lead in any of the defensive metrics, as someone who does place a lot of stock in stats in general, I'm going to think that I'm going to fundamentally disagree with that as well, because it's what we can tell, at least from these defensive metrics, is it seems easier to quantify the impact of bigs, whether that's because of the volume of shots they're facing around the rim and rebounds they're grabbing. It's just easier to quantify what it seems. I don't know this for a fact. So that's where I land on that. I don't have an issue with Marcus Smart winning. I wouldn't have had an issue if it was Rudy Gobert. Wouldn't have an issue if it was Giannis Antetokounmpo, Mikal Bridges, Jaren Jackson Jr. I think that we collectively also just have to get better with this idea of you see it when the all NBA teams come out, or when the award finalists came out, like we're naming the snubs, Jordan Poole from the most improved player discussion from the top three, then name who he has to replace. Like that's how we have to do this. Have an honest discussion about it. But also be comfortable with the idea that, yeah, you know what? Like it could have been Jordan Poole over Ja Morant or Darius Garland or I can't even remember who the other finalist was. Wow. DeJounte Murray, who was actually my pick. Wow. And that's just life, because there were so many deserving candidates. Let's be better about sort of accepting that as a reality.